Our presenter today is Emily Zobel. So she's going to be talking about cucurbits in depth. Emily?
I'll take it away. So today we're going to talk about growing cucurbits, which I think is probably one of my favorite groups of vegetables to grow, in part because they're super easy-ish, and I'll put easiest in quotes. Some of them are very easy to grow, some of them are a little bit more finicky. So we're going to just kind of do an overview of growing cucurbits, particularly in Maryland and Mid-Atlantic states. If you live in different areas of the United States or different countries, this could change, but a lot of the stuff will still be applicable to you guys. So University of Maryland Extension programs are open to everyone. At this point, I would recommend that you adjust your volume if you're having a hard time hearing, or if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can also put on closed captions if you need them to better hear or to be able to read along. So anyone who's seen me present knows that I like to give my resources right up front. For those of you that live in Maryland, the University of Maryland Home and Garden Information Center has a wide variety of resources around growing different types of cucurbits. So most of your main groups of cucurbits, so cucumbers, squash, winter squash, pumpkins, melons, etc., are each going to have an individual page on the University of Maryland Extension Home and Gardens. That'll look something like this. It'll say growing whatever in the home and garden. There'll be some pictures. This is where there's going to be a lot of information about like spacing and when to plant and fertilizer recommendations and variety recommendations and stuff like that. So I'm not going to go into all that nitty gritty here because you guys have a resource available to you to kind of do a lot of that. Likewise, underneath each one of these will also be issues in cucumbers or issues in squash or issues in pumpkins. That'll take you to a different website we have there where we talk about the main problems or issues you will have. So I'm going to touch on some of the common ones that you'd encounter in a garden, but those are by no means a complete list. So feel free to check this out as a resource. The additional thing we have on University of Maryland Extension is our Ask Extension or our Ask Our Expert. So on the front of the Home and Garden Information Center's website, there's going to be like a greenish button halfway down the bottom that is going to say Ask Extension or Ask an Expert. And this will allow you to submit up to 3 pictures and a question to our home and garden experts up at HGIC. And then they'll typically get back to you within about a few days to help you answer your question. So if you've checked our website and you just can't figure it out, that's also a great resource for you with regards to growing cucurbits. Cucurbits are super popular. Lots of people have grown them. So you can also find lots of gardening books, particularly at your local library, to help you kind of navigate growing cucurbits. So for those of you who have never heard of a cucurbit before, this is the gourd family, for lack of a better way. So these are a group of vegetables known as gourds. These are some of the most common ones that were grown and were some of the earliest ones that were domesticated by humans. So there's 975 known kind of species within gourds. Some of the common ones that we would think of to eat would be listed here. So cucurbit pepa would be things like your summer and winter squash, your pumpkins. Cucurbit maxima would be some of those harder winter squash. You've got things like cucumbers, watermelons, cantaloupes would also be in here. Some interesting things to note about this is that they have been domesticated in different areas across the world. So various versions of these have histories of domestication in different places. So like the earliest signs of cucumbers in particular come from India versus some of our summer squashes were found to be domesticated in the Americas. So think like Mexico and like Latin America and North America, while similar species were also being domesticated in like Africa. This group of vegetables or plants has been domesticated multiple times across multiple different communities and origins throughout history, which is really kind of fascinating. Most of them are treated as warm season annuals. There are some species in the cucurbit or gourd family that could be considered perennial, but they're not the varieties that we typically eat. So when we talk about growing them in our gardens, we're going to talk about them with regards to being warm season annuals. So this would mean that you would be planting them sometime in the spring, like right now, and you could grow them until about the first hard frost when the actual plants themselves will die back. They will not overwinter, so you'll have to replant them every single year. These plants do have what we call a monoecious flower, and we'll talk about that in a second. And again, these are some of our oldest domestic species. They are really popular to eat in particular because they're high in vitamins A and C. They also have a large amount of fiber. A lot of them can also would be considered very fleshy, and high in water concentration. So particularly some of our early domestications of the melons were used as a easier way to transport water in some cases, or to make sure that there was a water source comparatively. So I talked about them having monilicious flowers, and this basically means that they have separate male and female flowers, but these are typically on the same plant. So this isn't male plants and female plants, although we do have a few examples of that happening. But typically you're going to have male flowers that are going to be the first flowers that these plants will create. And then a few weeks later, they'll start making female and male flowers together. Now, a lot of the species that you have here in North America that were domesticated here in North America are specialized with a very cute, I'd say, group of pollinators, which is the squash bees, which are what you're seeing here. So if you grow any of these cucurbits in your garden, chances are you will see these squash bees hanging out in those big yellow flowers, getting covered in pollen, drinking up that nectar. And they have a very unique relationship in that they're kind of specialized for each other. So I always tell people, even if you don't care about growing any of these things to eat for yourself, plant a few of them in your garden for the squash bees, if nothing else, because they are a native species of bees and we need to support our native bees. And what better way to do that than to also grow something that you in return could eat or share with someone else among you. So generally speaking, for most of these cucurbits, it's going to take anywhere between 8 to 12 visits of that flower by pollinators in order to get significant fertilization. So one bee alone is not going to need to do it. You're going to need several bees to come and visit. And that most of these flowers are going to be open for a few days before they start to like deteriorate down. We do tend to find that fruit set and pollination quality decreases when we have hot, wet weather because these bees don't tend to visit these flowers when it's raining outside. And likewise, if you get super hot nights, that pollen tends to degrade. So if you're noticing, especially in like the heat of the summer, if we have a wet summer or a really humid summer, sometimes your fruits will be a little bit wonky in shape. Especially when we talk about cucumbers. And that oftentimes has to do with pollination set and in return the weather. Okay, so some general growing tips for growing cucurbits. So you can grow them either as transplants or direct seed. I think cucurbits are great ones for growing with kids because the seeds tend to be pretty big. If you've ever had a watermelon seed, I mean, that's probably one of the smaller seeds you're going to have for this group. So they're perfect for kids to plant, and you tend to plant them a little bit deeper than some of our other common vegetables. So again, they work really great with kids. If you're going to use transplants, which would be small kind of baby plants that you would either buy at a store or start yourself, you traditionally want to start those about 3 weeks prior to planting date. Now, here in Maryland, our planting date, because these are warm season annuals, is our frost-free date, which is Mother's Day, which is past at this point. So at this point, you could put any of these out in your garden at any point. And I would recommend at this point direct seeding instead of creating transplants, because why spend the time and energy to do it inside when you can go ahead and put them right outside, because we have a warm enough season happening. Our soil temperature is warm enough, our nighttime air temperature is warm enough for these guys. But if you did want to start these next year inside, you would start them about 3 weeks prior to time. They're pretty quick with germination, and they're pretty quick growers, especially if you put them in a warmish environment underneath a grow light like this one. You can use any sort of container. This is a basic pot, but I've started these things in like those red Solo cups. I've used like Dunkin' Donuts coffee cups, like the plastic ones that you get, poke a hole in the side. Those are perfect for germinating. Once you do move them outside, you do want to make sure that you water them fairly routinely. These guys, for the most part, are heavy water drinkers compared to some of our other vegetable crops, especially if you're doing some of the larger late season harvest ones. So things like pumpkins and the melons definitely are heavy with the water feeders. When it comes to watering, we want to water what we call deeply. So in order to get them to establish a good root system, you want to do less watering, but longer watering. So it's better for you to water these guys for, say, 30 minutes every other day than 15 minutes every day. Now, during the summertime, you may want to water 30 minutes every single day, especially if you're noticing them drooping. But ideally, water deeply, especially early in the season, to get them to establish that good root system. We recommend with these guys as well that you use something like a soaker hose or drip tape. Overhead irrigation that makes those leaves wet will increase the likelihood of you having various diseases on those leaves. And I'm going to talk about those diseases a little later on. All of these crops, since they are warm season, do want to be in full sun. So think somewhere between 8 to 10 hours of full sun. Morning sun tends to be better than afternoon sun for them. But if all you have is afternoon sun, that works. Just try to stay on top of the water. If it's 6 hours of intense sunlight, they will grow. They just may not yield as high as they would in like 8 hours of full sunlight. So when it comes to figuring out things like when to plant and spacing and all of that, I highly recommend checking your seed packet, or if you're buying transplants in the store, that little tag on the transplant would definitely help with regards to how you want to space these guys. Because cucurbits have such a wide variety of plants in them, there's no good generic here's how to space all of them, but that tag will help tell you. Because they're so popular, we now have some that have more bush varieties that you can plant a little bit closer. Most of these are vining varieties, so whether or not you trellis them or not will affect their spacing. And then things like watermelons and pumpkins are going to need a lot more space to spread out and vine than, say, something like cucumbers or squash would. So check the back of your seed packet for the wealth of knowledge on all that kind of spacing requirements. If you've thrown away the packet or you got your seeds from, say, like the free seed library and it just has the variety, you can easily Google it. Or Home and Garden Information Center also has some like generic spacing fertilization recommendations that'll help get you started with it. Some other things to note on your seed packet would be things like days prior to harvest. So that's going to tell you how long before you can expect a harvest. In this case, this one is a container variety. So it's a bush variety that would do well in a container. If you have any disease resistance to that particular variety, your label will also tell you this. If it's an heirloom or a hybrid variety, your label would also say this. Hybrid varieties are good because a lot of them have disease resistance, but we don't recommend seed saving from them because they don't breed true when it comes to seeds. So that's just something to note when you look at your seed packets. So now we're going to dive into what are some cucurbits and some basic tips on growing them. So cucumbers are one of my favorites. They're one that I always tend to grow. I've done some research on them, and I think they're one of the favorites to grow. You can find a vining variety, or they do have smaller, what we call bush varieties that don't require the trellis, and they sort of kind of bush up. The vining varieties, I recommend trellising them. I think trellising them can benefit it a lot, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But I find that when I have a vining variety and I trellis it, I tend to get better yields throughout the entire summer versus some of the bush type varieties will give kind of a good yield early on, but as the season progresses, they kind of peter off just as they age. So I tend to lean more towards the vining, trellising varieties, but again, it's up to you. There's so many different varieties of cucumbers out there. Typically, when you are planting cucumbers, think about whether or not you're going to be eating them fresh, or aka slicing cucumbers, or these cucumbers that you're going to pickle. You theoretically can do both with all varieties of cucumbers, but pickling cucumbers tend to have a less waxy skin than the slicing ones because you're going to be pickling them. So just when you're looking at cucumber varieties, some will say pickling varieties, some will say slicing varieties. You can use them for both, but just note that they're kind of more specialized to one or the other. Typically, most of your cucumbers are going to be ready to harvest within 45 to 65 days, and they will do more of a continuous harvesting. So as the plants grow, they will continue to generate flowers and they'll continue to generate fruit as long as you continue to kind of grow and water and care for them. Versus some of the other cucurbits we'll talk about will have like one big harvest at the end of the season. I do recommend with these guys, especially if you are pickling and you want that ideal perfect pickling size, that you check and harvest them every few days because they will continue to put on fruit one thing that the Home and Garden Information Center recommends is getting, if you really want cucumbers all season long, if you planted some now in May, we recommend starting some transplants, probably end of June, and then get ready to put in a second crop July 1. Just because as these plants age, they start to produce less. So if you want like good constant cucumbers all season long, as that first kind of crop dies off in the summer heat of July, you'll have a second crop ready to go. And you can get some disease resistance varieties in a lot of cucumbers, which I actually think is really useful just because it's one less thing that you need to worry about. Generally speaking, if you plant about 10 feet of cucumbers, you can expect to get 8 to 10 pounds of fruit off of that. And these are ones that will probably want to be fertilized halfway through. So once you start producing fruit, you probably want to give them a bunk of fertilizer then. So you can plant them in the ground or in a container, and like within a few weeks, once they start producing fruit, you generally want to fertilize them. So trellising cucumbers. So trellising is really useful and it's been shown to have lots of benefits, even though it sort of can be a little bit of a pain because you've got to have this extra structure. You can definitely trellis using like a chain link fence, but cucumbers, because they're a little bit heavier, sometimes you just want to make sure that that fence is nice and reinforced. By trellising your cucumbers, people have found that there tends to be an increase in yield. They also tend to get longer, straighter fruit. Because it's trellised and the bees can get more access to it, you tend to get better pollination rate, which helps with those fruit sets. This also is going to reduce the likelihood of you getting those soil-borne diseases or the rot taking place because the vines are off the ground. And this also tends to be easier for you to harvest them because you're not bending down quite as much. So generally speaking, when you do trellis, you are going to want to plant these plants about 4 to 5 seeds per foot. So generally speaking, when you trellis, you're just going to like every few inches put a plant and then they will work their way up. So here's some examples of ways to trellis that are pretty low key. I recommend trying to figure out how to do this as cheap as possible. I actually have a wood pallet that I've cut in half and I've done kind of a style like what they did here. So I have a wood pallet and then I just have some legs. You can potentially use the space underneath it to grow things that would be more shade resistant. So the way I have mine set up does get some sunlight underneath it. So sometimes I'll put in green beans, but I know other people have done things like spinach or heat tolerant lettuce that don't necessarily want full sun, but still allows them to grow during the summer. I've also seen people put things like flowers underneath there as well, which is kind of nice. And then here's just another example of one. So this one, you'd only really get one side. Here's one where it's two that you can put like this. I've seen people use ladders as well, or cattle gates. So just kind of think what you have around you. There are store-bought ones that you can purchase, but I tend to find with gardening, I like trying to figure out like what I can use that's around me in order to help me garden. So something to be conscious of is when you look at that seed packet or at the label, you may see the following descriptions when it comes to kind of cultivars, specifically around pollination. Some of your heirloom varieties of cucumbers might say something like standard or monoecious pollination. And this means that the first few flowers that they're going to make, so the first dozen to 2 dozen are all going to be male flowers. Because again, remember, we have male flowers and female flowers. And for every kind of female flower, they'll generally produce a male flower once the season gets going. So it's going to be a little bit more kind of 50-50. These are more likely to be your seeded varieties because they're going to have true pollination. You might find some that are called geonastic. These generally are going to have only female flowers being produced by the plant. What will happen is in that seed packet, they'll have most of the seeds will be this type, but they'll throw in a handful of the standards that will produce male flowers, so you still get pollination taking place. Most of the fruit that you're going to get off of this type are going to be seedless, but you still could get some, especially if you let them grow to be wider cucumbers, could potentially have seeds in them. The last varieties types that you could find are called parthenocarpic, and these ones are basically all female flowers and they're seedless. The flowers themselves can be fertilized without cross-pollination, so they'll self-fertilize and they'll create, if they create seeds at all, they're going to be like the very small, thin ones, so they would be considered like a seedless cucumber. If you do plant a mixture of these together, they will cross-pollinate. So then the seedless Parthenocarpic will then potentially have seeds in them. So that's just something to note so that you don't necessarily say, well, I planted these, they're seedless, and then I planted these that have seeds. Why didn't they grow true? And it's because they cross-pollinated. So I think when it comes to cucumbers, one of the things people like about them the most is pickling. So again, if you are going to grow cucumbers specifically for pickling, I would recommend selecting a variety more inclined for pickling. These tend to have less wax to their coat, which tends to make them better for the pickling process. When it comes to pickling, you do want to select firm cucumbers. I know a lot of people think of using food preservation as a way to kind of work with the older gunky ones they get. And while you could do that, ideally, especially if you're doing long-term storage for your pickles, you want to use the firmer cucumbers. Find the softer ones maybe you use for like a cucumber bread, the same way you'd make like a zucchini bread or something. When it comes to pickling, you do want to make sure that you harvest them at about the right size. So if you're doing the full pickles as picklings or the gherkins, you want them to be about 1.5 to 2 inches long. If you're doing dill pickles, technically about 5 inches long is what most people like. And then if you've got some oddballs, so if you've got too many pickles, maybe you've got some that are weird shaped, or maybe they're too long, or something like that. Those are the ones that you can dice up really small and use for relishes or your bread and butters. Both Penn State Extension and University of Georgia have really good handouts on pickling, both like recipes, how to go about doing it, varieties to consider. So I recommend those as two really great resources. University of Georgia specifically has the Center of Home Food Preservation. So if you're interested in things like jams and jellies and pickling other vegetables, they're my kind of resource that I would recommend doing. You can see they talk about a whole bunch of other options here, and they give recipes for things like bread and butter, the fast pack ones. So these would be like quick pickles that you would make and eat within like a month, how to do the gherkins or the hulls, sweet pickles, and all of that. So definitely a good resource that I would recommend checking out. So for those of you that have been growing cucumbers for a while and you want to try something a little different, this is a crop that I tried last year and I actually really loved them because I like tart things. So these are mouse melons, also known as Mexican sour cucumbers. So these guys need a trellis, hands down, and they need a sturdy trellis because they will grow vines that are 10 feet long, then can get moderately heavy just because of the plant matter. These generally take about 65 to 75 days till you get fruit, and they are native to Mexico and Central America. So if you really like that kind of cuisine, oftentimes you can find recipes that will involve these, but they produce these small fruit. So think kind of like cherry, large grape size, and they basically taste like a cucumber, but they're a little bit tartier. And I particularly like putting them with other things. So I'll put these along with things like chickpeas and a green onion, or sorry, a red onion and olives all together in kind of like a tart Greek salad type setup, or I'll put them on normal salads. I've also just been known to pick them in my garden and eat them because I like tart things, but they're kind of a fun one that's interesting to try. So now we're going to move into summer squash and zucchini. And I think this is another really common, popular one that a lot of us probably are already growing. So typically these plants are in what we call a bush shape or a bush style. You can technically trellis these, but most people don't because they don't necessarily need to. So you can generally find these in a few different varieties. So the yellow straight neck tends to be the one that most of us think of, like the summer squash that you see here. You can also find the saucer shaped. So these would be like the patty pan ones that are just kind of round and flat. And those are my favorite ones actually to grow because I find them to be a little bit more tender and soft. Or you can get kind of the oblong green ones, which are typically known as zucchinis. So from seed to harvest normally takes about 50 to 65 days, depending on the weather and our heat. And these you want to harvest when they're tender. So generally speaking, you want to check these plants every 3 to 4 days and harvest them when they're tender. I generally tell people about the length of your hand is about the longest you want them to get. Anything longer than that, and they'll start to develop seeds in them, and the middle will start to get tough, a little spongy like. So generally speaking, I tend to like to harvest these when they're smaller and more tender on them. So one thing that I do recommend with these is just like the cucumbers, is I recommend if you're planting some now to get ready to replant a second cropping in July. And there's a few reasons for that. One is the dreaded squash vine borer, which I'll talk about in a sec. And the other one is just that these guys, just like the cucumbers, tend to kind of peter off as they age. So you'll generally, if you start them in May, by like mid-July, they're going to start decreasing in their production. So by having some ready to replant them with in July or having some space in your garden to put a successional planting, you can maintain summer squash and zucchini throughout the growing season. These guys are a little less of a fertilizer hog as well, but you do want to kind of side dress them or give them a little extra boost of compost or fertilizer when you start seeing that first flower start. Or the first squash vegetables start to come about. So the next one we're going to talk about is winter squash. And this is one that I think a lot less people grow than the summer squash, but I actually started growing these last year and I prefer growing these over the summer squash, mainly because summer squash is pretty easy to find at farmers markets. These ones are a viner, so you can trellis them, but they do tend to have a little bit of a weight to them. So if you are going to trellis them, one thing that I recommend doing, especially for these larger ones, is to kind of trellis them and then make what we call like a baby sling with them. So this could be using old rags or an old t-shirt, and you would just, as soon as the fruit starts to develop, just make like a little sling where you tie the fruit, the base of the fruit, to the trellis itself, just so the weight doesn't pull down the vine and rip it off before it has a chance to mature. You can also grow these on the ground. They sprawl a little bit, but they're easy enough to kind of contain the vines. These are going to take about 60 to 100 days till they're ready for harvest. And something to note about these guys as well, the summer squash, we were harvesting every few days when they were tender. These guys, you are going to want to wait and harvest later in the season. And you're going to harvest when the fruit is mature. So this would be when seeds have actually developed and they're going to have that tough rind. And the nice thing about this is, one, most of those seeds, as long as you're not growing a hybrid, can get saved and you can replant them next year. Sometimes these seeds can get saved and you can dry them and eat them the way you would pumpkin seeds, because pumpkins technically fall under winter squash as well. And these guys actually store really well. So you can harvest them, and if you have kind of a dark, dry place that's a little bit on the cooler side, you can store these. If you harvested them end of August through September, you can generally keep these through like November or December before they kind of start to rot just from time's sakes. So I think these ones are a neat one to play around with. Some common varieties you would find in here would be things like acorn squash, which is my favorite variety to grow, but butternut would be in here. Your buttercup squash would also be ones to grow as well. So when you can note, you can see that. So one thing that you do want to remember when you are growing winter squash is that they're kind of like sweet potatoes in that they need a curing period. So when you would harvest it later in the season, you would store them someplace for about 5 weeks in order for them to switch over and to compound their sugars. So you would pick them and then store them. There's a few exceptions of these, and the packet will tell you if it doesn't need a curing period, but most of these will need this curing period. And here you can see is a study that came out of, I think this was North Carolina. So you can see if they cured it for 2 weeks versus several weeks, it goes from being a lighter orange to this deeper, darker orange. And this basically means that the sugars are getting more compact, so it becomes a sweeter, nicer fruit in it. So ideally you wanna cure these the same way you would like a sweet potato. Okay, so that takes us into pumpkins. So these are technically a type of winter squash, but a lot of times we think of them separate because you would do some of your like canning or your sweet pumpkins the way you would treat your winter squash, but every now and then people always want to grow kind of like jack-o'-lanterns or the big pumpkins or the decorative pumpkin. So if you're going to do that, it's important to note that you need to have a pretty good space for it. So pumpkins are not something that you're likely going to be able to do as a container plant on like a balcony or something. They just sprawl too much. Most of these vines want to sprawl out a few feet Definitely try them in your garden. They're fun to do, especially if you're growing some tall things. So like if you have a raised bed that you're putting in corn or sunflowers, you could definitely put some pumpkin plants near the base and they could sprawl in between of them. If you are going after one of those really large jack-o'-lanterns, you want to emphasize one big fruit per plant. So ideally, what you would do is you'd plant your vines, and then once it started getting big and you started to see a few come up, you'd pick the largest one and you're going to cull or cut back everything else. So one big fruit per one, and then you're going to continue to cut back the vines so that that plant spends all of its energy putting into one vine and one fruit. And you're going to care for this one for about 4 months. So it's going to take 4 months to get one of these really big pumpkin varieties. One thing we recommend tip-wise is to put some cardboard underneath that pumpkin so that it doesn't have contact with the soil, because that's where you could potentially get some rot issues. Another thing I would recommend is that as you're doing it, you want to be careful not to snap the stem, but you kind of want to roll the pumpkin every few days so that it doesn't get a flat side to it. And having that cardboard underneath it can kind of help you go back and forth with that. These guys do have a little bit more of a higher requirement when it comes to fertilization. So definitely check out the Home and Garden Information Center's fertilizer needs. And I would recommend that if you are planning to grow kind of big jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, along with any of these crops, you should get a soil test. So melons is another one that is really fun for people to grow. It is another one that does take up a fair amount of space. Most of the times when people think of melons, they think of things like honeydews, cantaloupes, and watermelons. And we'll talk about watermelons in a sec. But around here, when we talk about cantaloupes, what we're actually talking about is a species of muskmelon. Yep, so these guys do take a little bit longer to harvest than some of our squashes and other things. So you're looking at about 80 to 100 days. And these guys will generally have fruit that gets produced through and ripens through a few-week process. So you're going to get a late season flush of fruit over the period of about 3 to 4 weeks. And generally speaking, each plant's going to get you about 2 to 4 fruit on them. Melons are a vining one, so they are going to take a little bit more space. So you're looking at like 24 by 60-inch kind of square for them. And again, this is another one that we recommend putting cardboard underneath to keep them from rotting. Okay, so watermelon is another really one that people ask about. And again, it's a long viner. You're looking at 6 to 20 feet of vine, a longer time period till harvest, and then a 3 to 4 week period of harvesting. You can definitely get the seedless varieties of these. It's worth noting that the seedless varieties tend to have a lower germination rate, though, than the seed varieties do. And these are a little bit more finicky when it comes to those pollination requirements. So sometimes what you can do is get a pollination plant to put near them. However, if you have a seedless variety and you put in a pollinator plant, chances are you will end up with seeds in your watermelon just because of the cross pollination. So now I'm going to quickly go through some of the common issues that you may encounter when growing cucurbits. When growing anything in your garden, we do recommend that you follow an integrated pest management growing process. So this would be using different cultural and sanitational processes, as well as bringing in things like pollinators and other things to kind of boost your yields before defaulting to chemicals. So when it comes to cucurbits, there's a lot of abiotical issues. So these would be like environmental issues that would occur first. So it's important to remember not to just default into thinking that it's a biological issue. Just because you see some leaf browning or yellowing doesn't necessarily mean you have an insect pest. It could be caused by heat damage or moisture extremes. So staying on top of that. And again, in order to combat things like nutrient disorders, we recommend taking a soil test, especially if you're growing directly in the soil. Just to make sure that your soil is in good shape. Sometimes you fertilized and fertilized, but your pH is off, so the plant can't uptake the nutrients anyways. So that soil test can really help you figure that out. And you can find more information about the soil tests on the Home and Garden Information Center website. So one common issue that a lot of people encounter in cucurbits is blossom end rot. And this is the exact same thing that you get in tomatoes and peppers. It's just a nutrient disorder where you have a shortage of calcium, particularly at that growing end. So here you can see we've got 2 summer squash. This one's got a nice end, and this one has blossom end rot. So here's a few different things that you can do throughout the growing season to make sure that you kind of reduce the likelihood of blossom end rot. I will say once your fruit has blossom end rot, you can't get rid of it. So you're better off just cutting off and disregarding that fruit than allowing the plant to continue to put energy into it. But doing things like maintaining that proper soil pH, you can add in a fourth of cups of gypsum, making sure that you're watering properly. Sometimes your soil has calcium, but the plant doesn't have the proper amount of water in order to uptake it. And then avoiding those high nitrogen fertilizers can be useful because the lots of nitrogen will cause the plant to grow fruit and foliage really quickly, to the point where it can't uptake the rest of the nutrients it needs to make it balanced. So, because this is a imbalance of a nutrient. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the insect pests that you may encounter. So two of the most common ones that you would come across would be our cucumber beetles. So this would be our striped cucumber beetle because he's got stripes, or our spotted cucumber beetle. Our striped ones are going to overwinter as adults. We get one generation per year, and these guys tend to come out kind of pretty early in the season and will be consistent through the summer. It's worth noting that they do transmit bacterial wilt disease, so there's a valid reason to kind of control them. That being said, you can find varieties that are resistant or more resistant to bacterial wilt and the viruses, and that means that you don't necessarily have to worry quite as much about these guys feeding. Now, the spotted cucumber beetle overwinters down in the southern states and then migrates up here in June or July, so you tend to see it as kind of a midsummer through fall pest, and we tend to get 2 to 3 generations of it throughout the year. These guys will feed directly on the plant, both the leaves and the fruit itself. If you do have some fruit that has feeding like this, as long as it hasn't punctured too deep down, this is still edible. You could cut this part off, and as long as you're not seeing any fungal diseases inside, it's completely edible for you. Particularly when it comes to the leaf feeding, once your plants are really well established, they can take a little bit of the leaf feeding, and that's fine. Early on, they sort of need to be controlled. The bigger reason to control these guys is because of the diseases they transmit. But if you're planting resistant varieties and you don't want to spend the time and energy to kind of control, that's okay. Just note that there is still the possibility that your plants could get either bacterial wilt or mosaic virus from these. So some things that you can do is removing any of your garden debris, keeping your beds clean. You floating row covers on any or all of your cucurbits up until when they bloom. Once they bloom, because they need to be pollinated, you probably want to remove the floating row covers. Kaolin clay, also known as surround, which is seen on this plant here, is a really good way to kind of keep these beetles from feeding on your plants. It also helps with early on seedlings kind of transitioning to that harsher sunlight, especially if they've been in a nice greenhouse and they've been getting babied. You can also use permethrin or neem products on seedlings to kind of protect them from this. Both of those are organic products, and we do recommend reading and following the label. And then you can also avoid planting some of these plants until after June 15th. Normally, at least that striped one comes out pre-June 15th, and it will find alternative plants to feed on. So after June 15th, it generally has already found a plant to feed on. You may still get some later on, but it's a one option if you really don't want to deal with them. So squash bug is another one you'll oftentimes find in your home garden. These are a true bug, meaning they have a piercing, sucking mouth part. They're mainly going to be pests on squash and pumpkins. You occasionally find them on like melons and cucumbers, but they're more likely on squash and pumpkins. They like to feed as a group, so you very rarely just get one. And once you have a handful of adults on there, they will mate and proceed to lay their eggs, which are copper colored and look like this, and they'll lay in clusters. So then once those eggs hatch, you'll have a cluster of squash bug nymphs that will be on there, and then the cycle kind of repeats. You tend to find these late May through early June, and then the populations will continue to grow throughout the growing season. This is kind of what their feeding damage looks like. You can see all the beetles feeding feeding underneath. Again, they're big group feeders. You'll get this kind of browning around the edges along with yellowing, and that's just because as they feed, they're sucking up the sap and taking out some of the moisture, so the leaves in return are drying up and crinkling to it. These plants, if fed heavily enough, will eventually wilt and collapse. Generally speaking, in a home garden situation, you tend to not build up a high enough population for this, especially if you're on top of it. So some things that you can do to kind of reduce the likelihood of getting a large population would be to avoid heavy mulching. These guys, particularly sometimes when they go on hot days, will go down into like mulched areas. So avoid thick mulch around your plants. You can use those floating row covers until they bloom. A duct tape loop is really good for pulling off both the nymphs and the egg masses. There's a wide variety of natural enemies that you can entice in by planting flowers around your plants, and then you can spray your plants as well with an insecticide if needed. The spray threshold tends to be when you have one egg mass per plant, and you can use organic things like neem oil or permethrin. You can also just hose your plants down with a heavy stream of water. A lot of times that'll knock off, especially those little nymphs, and sometimes it will discourage them from getting back on. So squash vine borer is probably everyone who grows squash has encountered this. This one is a hard insect pest to manage. It's a type of clearwing moth, and it prefers winter squash, summer squash, and pumpkins. I very rarely find it in cucumbers, and occasionally you'll find it in a watermelon, but not nearly as much as the other. It will overwinter as a pupae in the soil. The adults are going to emerge sometime like mid-June through July. And what makes this a major pest is that it lays its egg down at the base of the stem of your plants, and then the larvae or the caterpillar will hatch out and will burrow into that stem. And it will basically cause your plant to wilt and die from the inside out. And because that caterpillar is inside the stem, it's really hard for natural enemies to get to it. It's hard for it to fall off the plant. It's hard for birds to get to it. It's also hard for a lot of treatments to happen because oftentimes you don't notice that it's there until after it's already kind of damaged your plant. So again, here's a picture of the larvae living inside of the vine. Basically, as it feeds, it cuts off that xylem and the phloem. So what'll happen is your plant might look fine in the morning, but by mid-afternoon, it looks super wilty. And that's a sign that you may potentially have something wrong. If you go look at it, the stem will look swollen and it will have a lot of this poop or frass around it. If you give it a pull, sometimes it'll even snap completely off. You can, if you catch this early enough, slice the stem open, pull out this larvae, and smush the larvae and then rebury the stem. And sometimes your squash plants will recover from it. A lot of times I just tend to say having, again, that sequential planting. So I know that I'll start getting these guys end of June, beginning of July. So I know that I'll probably just rip out my May squash and plant fresh in July. And then sometimes I'll even have a third planting ready to go in the end of July, beginning of August, when I know they've kind of transitioned out. So they are hard to control. You can try to put a barrier down at the base, but sometimes they'll just go above and below it. So the best thing to do is to destroy any infected crops. You can till your soil in your garden. Another thing is just to skip every other year. So grow squash one year and then skip it the next year and then grow it again the following year. So occasionally I do see spider mites on plants, especially if we have hot, dry weather. These guys feed on the plant and they're going to cause this kind of yellow stippling pattern. And it's going to cause the leaves to kind of crust and curl over, and it can basically lead to a reduced fruit set. So that's kind of what your leaves are going to look like. They're going to have this kind of dirty webbing around them. Ideally, you just want to go ahead and manage the weeds around your crops. And if you do encounter them, you can spray it down with a hose of water. I typically recommend just removing the plant so that they don't spread to other things and then replanting another plant in its place. So some of our beneficial insects to keep an eye on, and if you see them, you want to leave them alone, would be things like our parasitic wasps and parasitic flies. These guys are going to feed on those pests. You may also see things like ladybird beetle larvae or lacewing larvae or sulfid fly larvae, which are all really good feeders that like to feed on the eggs and things like aphids and stuff that would be on your plants. So now we're going to dive into some more common diseases. So this is a chart that kind of shows you where you could get resistant varieties or like which ones are more prone to others. Again, I tend to pick more resistant varieties in my garden if given the option, just because it's one less thing that I need to worry about. When it comes to disease management, there's no way to undo any damage that the disease has caused. So you really want to be preventative when it comes to disease management. Plant those resistant varieties if you have the ability to and the option to. Control weeds, because a lot of times those weeds will work as a vector for those diseases. If you do have diseased plants, we recommend removing them as quick as possible to reduce the spread of that disease and removing any debris. And this doesn't necessarily mean you have to remove the whole plant. If there's just a stem or a leaf or two, or again, the diseased fruit, take them out. Periodically clean any equipment that's coming in contact with these. You can use a 1 to 10 bleach or rubbing alcohol solution on them. Water management is a big one when it comes to these, as a lot of your fungal diseases are going to get spread through water. So by using something like a drip tape or a soaker hose, you can reduce the likelihood of the spread of that. And then if you are going to use a fungicide or a chemical control, make sure you get the underside of the leaf because that's ideally where a lot of those fungal spores are. So Chlorophylla rot is probably the most common one that I see taking place on particularly squash, and this happens on the blossom end. So that same end that blossom end rot would happen, this will happen. So in this case, it's the end that's not attached to the plant. So you've got the plant end and then the flower end. This technically tends to favor our warm, humid, rainy weather. So if you do have a period of kind of summer periods where you have lots of rain and then some hot days and then rain and hot days, you'll oftentimes see this. It's pretty iconic because you'll get these big fluffy kind of spores with these little black dots on them. It is a pathogen that lives in the soil that's opportunistic. So it lives in the soil, it's generally harmless, but when we get that ideal weather condition, it can splash up on your fruit and infest. So when that happens, go ahead and just remove this infected fruit. You're not going to want to eat this. And again, it's better to remove it so this doesn't spread to other fruits and so that your plant doesn't spend time and energy putting into this fruit anymore. Some ways that you can kind of reduce this would be putting some type of cover underneath the plant. So this could be growing on something like a mulch or a plastic mulch. You can also put like newspaper or cardboard underneath just to reduce that soil to fruit contact. Powdery mildew is another kind of common disease that you will find. All cucurbit species are susceptible to this, and it's going to have this white powdery kind of look to it. You're going to find it on both the top and the bottom part of the leaves. If you turn it upside down, it's going to look yellow underneath. And generally speaking, this doesn't flat out kill the plants, but it will reduce their ability to photosynthesize, which in return is going to reduce the size and the number of the fruit. It can also cut back on the sugar content and the ripening and can lead to sun scald as those leaves die back. So best when you do this, a wide variety of kind of organic fungicides you can get out there, and you would just treat the plant with it. If it's only on 1 or 2 leaves, you can snip those leaves off. Or if the whole plant's infested and it's later in the growing season, you may just want to go ahead and remove it. Downy mildew is another one that commonly gets confused with powdery mildew, but this one tends to be more angular than circular when it comes to its patterns. You're going to get pale green to yellow coloration on the top, and then when you flip it over is when you're going to get these kind of white to black spores on the underside. And in this case, you're oftentimes going to see leaf curling and then defoliation happening. So here's a leaf that has the comparison of the two. So powdery mildew is going to look powdery from above and white, and the downy mildew is going to look yellowish from above. So bacterial wilt is another one that I don't necessarily see as common in backyard gardenings. I tend to see this more in commercial settings. So this one's common on cucumbers and melons, but it can affect all. And this one's one that striped cucumber beetle is going to spread. And basically it clogs up the xylem and the phloem, and that causes the plant to wilt. So your plant might look healthy in the morning, but it may look droopy by like midday in the summer heat, kind of like this one is. So there's a wide variety of viruses that can infest cucurbits. Most of the varieties that you're going to find in seed packets are now going to be resistant to a lot of these viruses. If you do have one that does happen to have viruses, or you'll notice that it has like these disformed leaves and it'll have this marbling pattern. All you want to do is go ahead and just remove that plant. There's nothing that's going to stop the transmission or is going to bring that plant back. It will yield, but it will have a reduced yield, and you're better off just removing it. So to try to combat that, you really want to control your aphid and your spotted cucumber beetle. And by the time you see the plant looking infested like this, it's too late to combat those insects. And again, you really just want to remove the plant at that point. And with that, if there are any questions, I will take them. Hopefully, I haven't scared anyone away from growing cucurbits. I think they are probably one of my favorites to grow and to eat.
For now, good luck gardening, and thank you all.